Have you ever wondered, what if the creature you once saved came back, just in time to save you? Lydia Hartwell, a grieving schoolteacher, is driving across an old wooden bridge when it suddenly collapses. Her car plunges into the river, and just as she's about to drown, a massive, scarred Bigfoot dives in and pulls her to safety. The shock? It's the same young Bigfoot she saved 10 years ago, but he remembers more than just her. In a cave deep in the forest, he shows her a worn hair clip, the one Lydia's daughter wore before she died. He was there that day. He saw what Lydia never could, and he never forgot. Based on real ranger reports and a family journal long hidden, this story is more than folklore. It's a legacy of connection, loss, and redemption. You'll witness a bond that crosses species, and a forest that holds memory better than we do. Because sometimes, the thing that pulls us back from the edge isn't a human hand, but the memory of a forest shaped like a Bigfoot. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? What's your name, dear listener? And how far do you think a story like this can travel? If this tale moved you even just a little, hit like, subscribe, and help us build a global tribe of Bigfoot believers and gentle hearts. From our forest to yours, thank you for being here. The road twisted like a ribbon of dusk through the forest, and the sky above Blue River was bleeding the last of its October light. Lydia Crane had driven this way for years, past the faded general store, across the moss-covered bridge, down into the trees that seemed older than memory itself. But today, the silence felt heavier, not peaceful, waiting. The tires of her old Toyota pickup whispered over damp leaves as she reached the wooden bridge. She slowed, eyes flicking toward the river. It ran thick this time of year, swollen from recent rain, carrying foam and fallen branches like forgotten words. The wooden slats beneath her creaked, groaned, but they always did. She knew this bridge, trusted it. Then it shifted. A jolt ran through the frame of the truck, sharp, wrong. The whole vehicle lurched to the left. One of the slats collapsed beneath the front tire with a sickening crack. The steering wheel jerked out of her hands. Her heart punched against her ribs. There was no time to scream, no time to think. The bridge had been cut. The truck dropped, nose first, plunging into the cold belly of the river. The world shattered into water and glass. Lydia's chest slammed the steering wheel. Air vanished. A burst of pain lit her side. Her seatbelt caught tight, but her door was already jammed, and the water surged in like 1,000 fists. Her lungs clutched. She scrambled for the release latch. It wouldn't budge. The window was cracked open an inch, sucking in a violent stream. The river wasn't just rising. It was devouring. She kicked. Nothing. Her breath went ragged, shallow, fingers numb, vision tunneling. Then something worse than water came rushing in. Memory. The hospital hallway, that room, that silence. Her daughter's name had been Willow. She hadn't said it aloud in 6 years. The water pressed at her throat, slithering cold against her skin like the fingers of grief. Her body shook with the instinct to survive, but her mind had already given up once before. That morning on the floor of the kitchen, after the call, after the officers left, after they found the body. She never made it to the funeral. Couldn't. This was how it ends then. The water reached her jawline, a whisper in the dark. "Mom!" It wasn't a memory. It was here, inside the cab. The voice was faint, sweet. Impossible. "Mom, get up!" Lydia's eyes snapped open. She saw movement outside the shattered windshield. A massive blur. Dark, impossible, powerful. Crashed through the current. Then a shape. No. A figure. One that shouldn't exist. Arms wider than her body. Shoulders like stone. It grabbed the crushed frame of the truck and ripped. The metal screamed. Water surged. Hands, too large to be human, wrapped around her torso and yanked her free like a rag doll. She couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of anything except the sensation of speed and strength. the shock of cold, and a heartbeat that didn't belong to her, thudding like a drum behind fur-covered ribs. The surface shattered into stars. Air, glorious and sharp, filled her lungs. She gasped, coughing hard, throat raw. She blinked against the blur of twilight. They were on the bank now, gravel and wet leaves beneath her, the sky bleeding into deep violet above. She turned her head, and she saw it. The creature towered above her, soaked, heaving, covered in thick fur matted with river water. Eyes deep set. Not wild, not cruel, wounded. There was a long scar down its left shoulder, angled, rough, but unmistakable. Lydia's lips parted. She knew that scar. 10 years ago, on a cold spring evening not unlike this one, she'd been walking a logging trail with a first aid kit in her car. She'd found a wounded animal then, too. Something huge, trembling against a fallen tree. She thought it was a bear at first, until it looked at her. Until she saw something human in its gaze. It hadn't attacked. It hadn't run. It let her stitch the wound with shaking hands and a needle from her sewing kit. It bled like anything else. Flinched like anything else. Then it vanished. She never spoke of it again. But here it was, standing over her. He remembered. The scar remembered. Lydia's vision blurred. Not from the river. From something older, deeper. She sat up slightly, chest tight, heart still pounding, as the creature slowly knelt beside her. Not threatening, not afraid. It reached down, gently now, cupping the back of her head with one enormous hand, the way a mother might hold a crying child. Then her eyes drifted to the ground behind him. 2 sets of footprints, one massive broad, his, the other smaller, barefoot, inhuman, but tiny. Her breath caught. There was more than one. Before she could speak, the creature leaned down, slid one arm beneath her knees, another beneath her shoulders, and lifted. It carried her like she weighed nothing. Lydia didn't resist. The forest swallowed them. The only sound was the wind catching in the trees like a sigh that had waited too long. Her eyes fluttered as they moved deeper into the dark. The rhythm of his stride was steady, almost soothing. Her head pressed against thick fur that smelled of cedar, earth, river stone. She was shivering, yet oddly warm. Safe. She thought again of her daughter's voice, the softness in it, the impossible timing. Was it memory? Or had something, heard that grief echo loud enough to answer? As she drifted in and out of consciousness, the edges of the world softened. Trees blurred into shadows. The pain in her ribs dulled. The last thing she saw before darkness took her again was a small figure, far behind them, half hidden behind a tree trunk, a child, not human, watching with eyes too large for its face, eyes that blinked slowly. Curiously, the child stepped forward, just a little, then vanished into the brush. And Lydia, for the first time in years, did not feel abandoned. The arms that carried her were steady. The forest did not feel cold. She closed her eyes as they slipped beneath a curtain of ferns and stone. The last sound she heard was not the wind, not the river, but the low rumbling breath of the creature beside her, alive, present, remembering, carrying her towards something she could not yet name, and something, she would soon learn, had been watching her for far longer than she ever imagined, something that remembered kindness and never forgot a debt. When Lydia woke, it wasn't light that greeted her, but warmth, not the sharp heat of fire or the sterile burn of hospital sheets. This was something older, thicker. It clung to her skin and bones like breath held too long. A dense, primal heat that pulsed with life. The air smelled of pine sap and wet stone, of earth sealed away from the world above. She didn't know where she was, only that she wasn't cold anymore. She stirred slowly. The ache in her ribs hadn't vanished, but it had dulled to something distant. Her eyelids felt heavy. There was no mattress beneath her, only something soft and uneven. Layers of moss, dried leaves, and what felt like animal pelts. Above her, the ceiling curved down in uneven rock. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering gently, like reflections off water. But there was no fire. Her eyes adjusted. The glow came from an opening in the stone. Not quite a cave, but a hollow pocket, hidden in the folds of a hillside, maybe. Just large enough to shelter a body, or two, and she wasn't alone. Across from her, facing the narrow entrance, was the creature, hunched slightly, still, watching the dark beyond the doorway as if expecting something to come through it, as if guarding her. Its massive shoulders rose and fell slowly. Not asleep, waiting. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was something stranger. The way you feel waking from a fever dream that somehow remembers you. The creature? Rowan. The name floated into her mind without invitation. Had placed things around her while she was unconscious. A patchwork of found warmth. An old woolen blanket, worn at the edges but still intact. Furs, some natural, some clearly traded or scavenged. Ribbons of moss tucked gently beneath her neck and knees, softening the stone. But it was the small details that stopped her heart. A child's hair clip, faded, rusted at the hinge, still locked with a strand of blonde hair. Lydia's chest seized. It was Willow's, the one she'd lost on the hiking trail the day her daughter wandered off chasing fireflies. The one they never recovered. Just a trinket. A ghost. She hadn't seen that hair clip in 10 years, but it was here, in this cave, resting on a smooth stone like an offering. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. The metal was cold, but the memory it held was warm. Her daughter had called it her lucky butterfly. She used to clip it to her backpack, always the same way, slightly off-center, always facing forward. Lydia turned to look at Rowan. He hadn't moved, but he was watching her now. Not her body, her reaction, as if he remembered too. Her gaze dropped to his shoulder. The fur was parted in a thick groove of scar tissue, jagged, familiar. Her hands knew that shape. Her needle had once traced it, threading skin with trembling purpose when she thought he was just a wounded animal. Now, all these years later, the stitch was still visible. He had carried it with him, a scar and a memory. And somehow, he had carried her daughter's clip too. Her throat ached. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Instead, she lifted a hand, slowly, gently, and touched the edge of the scar. Rowan didn't flinch. His breath stayed even, eyes soft. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, of everything they somehow already knew. Then came the sound, faint, like bird chatter, but different, from outside or deeper in the cave. It rose and fell like a question asked by a child who didn't yet know fear. Lydia stiffened. It wasn't bird song. It was voices, high-pitched, light, too human to be animal, too wild to be human. Rowan turned his head slightly, listening. Then, with careful movement, he placed a massive hand on the ground beside her, as if to say, "Stay." He rose, ducking slightly to move toward the sound, every muscle quiet, every step deliberate. Lydia sat up, her body protesting, but her mind suddenly sharp. She followed him with her eyes. There was a second chamber, just beyond the narrow opening of this one, a bend in the stone she hadn't noticed. Rowan slipped into it, disappearing from view. The voices grew louder. Now she could hear giggles, huffs, a sound like the swish of fur against a rock. She crawled toward the edge, peered through, and froze. 4 of them, 4 small figures. Not children, not beasts, something in between. Each one was unique. One darker, one paler, one with a patch of white down its back, one barely larger than a toddler. They huddled together in a loose circle, piled on layers of bark and furs, eyes wide, bodies shivering. And yet, despite their size, their gazes felt ancient, not old in years, old in knowing. The smallest one clutched something in its hand, a piece of cloth, frayed, torn. Lydia's vision blurred again. It was a corner of her daughter's baby blanket. She'd sewn the edge herself, years ago, The exact pattern. A faded patch of stars. She'd thought it lost forever. One of the creatures, Mirth, the name surfaced like a breath, looked up at her. Not startled, just curious, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then the others turned. No panic, no fear, only breathless stillness. Rowan stepped between them, lowering himself. His massive arm curled slightly around the group, protective, parental, but also reverent, as if this was something sacred. And then Lydia understood. They weren't his children, but he had taken them in. She didn't know where their mother was, but she knew in her gut what had happened. There was grief in the way they leaned against each other, hunger in the slump of their limbs. One of them, Stone, limped as it shifted. Another, Ridge, had a bandage, clumsily made, wrapped around its hand. Wren, the smallest, whimpered faintly when the air touched its side. Lydia stepped fully into the chamber. Not a sound. She moved slowly, knees cracking as she lowered herself to the ground. The moss felt damp beneath her, but the heat of so many bodies made the air thick. She reached out her hand. Wren shuffled forward, touched her fingers. Tiny, fragile, warm, and just like that, she was back in that hospital room, holding Willow's hand, feeling it go still. But this one wasn't still. This one was alive. Shaking, but alive. Rowan didn't stop her. He watched, and when Lydia gently pulled Wren into her lap, when the tiny creature curled into her chest, he let out a low exhale. Not fear, not warning. Relief. Something shifted inside her. Something old. Something maternal. Something broken that hadn't dared feel warmth in years. Her hand brushed Wren's back. The fur was soft, tangled. The heartbeat underneath it was erratic, fluttering like a trapped bird. Poison, she realized. The stream. The one she crossed every year on her hikes. It had looked off lately. The foam thicker, the moss dying, and the bodies of these children, listless, weak, told her everything she needed to know. Rowan must have known they were dying, and he brought her here. Because once, 10 years ago, she stitched his wound and walked away. And now, he was returning the choice. Not the debt, the choice. She could walk away again. Or she could stay. Wren whimpered softly in her arms, and Lydia pulled the blanket tighter around both of them. Rowan met her eyes, and in the dim stone glow, they understood each other. She whispered without sound, "I'm here." Outside, the wind shifted. But inside the cave, the warmth remained. Not from the fire, but from something far older, far more human. And as the dark deepened, and the breathing around her slowed, Lydia held the smallest one close and prepared for what would come next, not knowing how far this forest would go to remember a kindness, or how far she would go to return one. The cave deepened into silence. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night laid itself thick over the forest like a blanket that remembered winter. Somewhere above, owls called to one another in slow, measured syllables. But down here, beneath the mossy rock, everything felt still. Not dead, not asleep, just holding its breath, holding. Lydia sat with her back to the stone, arms still wrapped gently around Wren, the smallest of the four. The little body curled into her chest gave off a fragile warmth, like a baby animal that hadn't yet decided whether it trusted the world. She could feel each rise and fall of its chest, the shallow flutter of a heart not yet steady. Rowan stood at the mouth of the cave, a silhouette against the outside dim. His shoulders were squared toward the dark, listening. Every so often, he tilted his head as if catching some distant frequency that humans had long since lost. But inside, near Lydia's feet, the other three huddled together, barely moving. Mirth, with eyes too large and too bright for such a small face, held a torn piece of bark in her hands and traced invisible lines across it like she was trying to remember a map no one had taught her. Ridge leaned back against the cave wall, one foot dragging across the dirt in slow, tired circles. Stone had tucked himself halfway under a hide, but his gaze never left Lydia. Watching, waiting. They weren't like human children. They didn't fidget, didn't speak. but the weight of their silence was louder than words. They had the look of creatures who had already seen too much. Lydia's body ached, but she didn't dare move. She was still trying to piece together how they got here. Why that hair clip had been in Rowan's care. Why that torn piece of baby blanket had ended up in Wren's hands. And why Rowan had risked pulling her from a sinking car when he could have just watched from the trees. Her fingers brushed Wren's fur again. Beneath it, she felt heat. But something else too. Fever. The little one's skin was too warm. She shifted slightly and glanced around the cave. No water jugs, no fire. Just a few bundles of leaves and hide. Rowan hadn't scavenged supplies. He'd brought her. Her. Because he couldn't fix this alone. She looked toward the other children again. Stone's breath rattled. His chest rose unevenly. His lips, if they could be called that, were cracked. Ridge rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist and let out a sound so soft it barely registered, a kind of dry whimper. Mirth just stared at the ceiling like she was waiting for it to open. Lydia laid Wren gently onto the bedding and rose. Her knees cracked under her, and her palms braced the cave wall as she found her balance. Rowan turned as soon as she moved, head low, eyes alert. She lifted her hand slowly. No danger, just her. And then pointed to the edge of the cave, where the stream outside glimmered faintly in the moonlight. He nodded once. Stepped aside. She stepped out. The air outside was sharp, clean, damp from recent rain. She walked to the stream, cupped water in her palms, and let it trickle through her fingers. Then she knelt down and scooped again, watching how the moonlight caught in the current. At first glance, it looked normal. But the foam around the rocks clung too thick, and the color, off, just enough to unsettle. When she dipped her fingers and smelled them, the scent wasn't fresh. It was metallic, almost sour. Something was wrong with the water. She looked back toward the cave, toward the four shapes curled inside. Of course they were sick. Her chest tightened. Back inside, she tried to make them drink. Mirth turned away. Stone bared tiny teeth. Ridge didn't react at all. But Wren took a few drops from her fingers and let out a faint sigh that felt too final. She turned to Rowan. "You brought me here because they're dying, didn't you?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. But something in his eyes shifted. He sat slowly, arms resting on his knees, and his gaze dropped to the smallest of the four. His brow furrowed. Not in anger. In helplessness, it hit her like a wave. He wasn't their father, but he was the only thing standing between them and death. She looked back at Wren. The trembling. The way that cloth had been clutched like an anchor. The children were weak, malnourished, dehydrated. But more than that, they were grieving. Something sharp twisted in her gut. She stood and walked deeper into the chamber. At the far end of the cave, half hidden behind a curtain of moss and debris, lay a still shape. She knew before she reached it what it was. The body was curled on its side, fur matted, one leg twisted unnaturally. The snare still clung to its ankle, the teeth of it rusted with blood. Bigfoot, female, larger than the children, smaller than Rowan, and clearly dead for days. Lydia dropped to her knees. She couldn't breathe. This was their mother. That's why they weren't moving. Why their eyes looked older than they should. They hadn't just been poisoned. They had been orphaned. All at once. She turned back and saw Ridge watching her. The child had pulled his knees to his chest. Not crying, just existing, hollow. And now it made sense why that corner of baby blanket had ended up in their hands. Why the clip had been kept all these years. Rowan had known where to look, and he had known who to bring. She reached slowly for the edge of the snare, fingers brushing the cold metal, and winced at the precision of it. Factory-made, manufactured, not an accident. Someone had set this trap, and they had set it deliberately. She remembered the bridge, the clean cut, the way her truck dropped like it had been invited to fall. This wasn't coincidence. Someone out there wanted something dead. Maybe not just the mother. Maybe Rowan. Maybe even her. The thought clanged through her like church bells in winter. She stood slowly, walked back to the others. Rowan was still watching the trees. She touched his arm. He looked at her. Her voice cracked. "We need to move them. This cave, it's not safe." He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. He stood, turned, and behind him, one by one, the 4 children began to rise. Mirth stepped forward first, eyes steady. Then Ridge, wobbling slightly. Stone needed Rowan's help. Wren took Lydia's hand, fingers wrapping around hers with barely enough strength to grip. They didn't cry, didn't speak. They simply followed. Because when you've lost everything, you don't question what's next. You just hold on to the hand that doesn't let go. The forest felt different as dawn crept in. Not softer, not warmer, just exposed. Like the night had been a blanket pulled back too quickly. Lydia walked behind Rowan as he moved through the trees, every step of his long stride quiet and deliberate, as if he knew the woods were listening. The 4 little ones clung close to the ferns along the path, their tired bodies slipping in and out of shadows. Wren held onto Lydia's shirt with one small hand, never letting go. The light filtered through the pines in thin, pale blades. It stretched over the moss, the rocks, and the narrow trail Rowan was following. Lydia didn't recognize this side of Blue River. It was deeper, untouched by hikers, the kind of place locals only mentioned in whispers or half-remembered stories. The kind her father called the old roots. The kind her grandfather had walked before conservation laws fenced off entire valleys. She had no idea where Rowan was leading her, but she understood why he wanted her to see it. There was something he needed her to know. By mid-morning, the air thickened with the smell of rust and old rainwater. Rowan slowed. Lydia felt Wren tense against her. Stone froze entirely, fingers digging into the bark of a fallen tree. Ridge looked around as if expecting something to leap from the bushes. Even Mirth, normally the most alert, ducked behind Rowan's leg. Lydia stepped closer, and the sight hit her all at once. The mother's body had been moved. Rowan hadn't been able to bury her. The ground was too rocky, too frozen in places. So he'd placed her in a clearing circled by stones and branches, arranged with a care so gentle it hurt to see. Her fur was brushed. The snare still clamped around her ankle. The earth beneath her stained a deep brown that matched dried pine sap. Lydia knelt beside her, her breath catching. The snare was branded. The letters were small, etched into the metal with a cruel, practiced hand. SP. The same initials her grandfather used to warn her about every time they visited the edge of Pike County. Samuel Pike. The man whose property bordered these woods on the far side. The man who'd bragged about clearing varmints. The same man who'd mocked her grandfather's belief in respecting wildlife. She touched the cold steel, and in one crushing moment, everything aligned. Rowan's old scar, her truck falling through the bridge, the poisoned stream, the mother's snare, the poisoned water. This wasn't nature turning savage. This was someone turning the forest into a battlefield. Lydia felt her pulse hammer in her throat. The morning air tightened, pressing around her ribs as she stood again. Rowan watched her, his expression unreadable but heavy with something like sorrow. Or maybe exhaustion. A memory flickered behind her eyes, one she hadn't thought of in years. Her grandfather arguing with Samuel Pike at the county store. Samuel bragging about thinning out the monsters. Her grandfather saying something that had stayed with her since childhood. "Those things in your traps aren't monsters, Sam, but you might be." She exhaled shakily and stepped closer to Rowan, lifting the snare a little. "You brought me here to see this," she murmured. He lowered his head slightly. A nod. Then she noticed something else. Footprints. Human ones. Fresh. Pressed into the mud near the clearing. The heel marks deep from boots worn by a man who'd walked with purpose. Another print overlapped by mud told her someone had come back recently. Just hours ago, maybe. And on a rock near the edge of the clearing, wedged into the moss, was the end of a cigarette. Still fresh, faint aroma lingering. A brand Samuel Pike chewed on the filter of. She'd smelled it on his coat once, when he'd leaned too close at the county meeting. Her blood ran colder. He'd been here, watching. Maybe watching Rowan, maybe watching her, maybe both. Rowan tensed suddenly, lowering himself into a defensive crouch. His gaze swept the forest. The 4 little ones pressed against Lydia's legs. She felt her breath slow, her body automatically sinking lower, instinct curling around her spine. But nothing emerged. No branches snapped. No voices carried through the trees. Still, she could feel it too. Someone had stalked this clearing. Someone who set traps not for food, not for protection, but for cruelty. Lydia moved around the body, eyes tracing the ground for more clues. Her fingertips grazed a set of indentations near the stream bed. Wide, deep, not Rowan's. Another Bigfoot. One older than the mother, larger than her. The prints were distorted at the edge, as if the creature had slipped fighting something. Poison again. The runoff flowed from an old abandoned mine further upriver. Locals had warned against drinking near it. Samuel had laughed, saying the poison kept the beasts moving. Her jaw clenched. The forest had been crying out long before Lydia ever heard it. Rowan approached her quietly now. Something in his posture softened. He placed his enormous hand gently on the earth beside the prints. His fingers pressed into the mud, as if confirming what she already knew. He had not been the only one watching her all these years. She had been part of a map only he had understood. Their stories intertwined long before they met again. A shiver ran across her shoulders. She reached for the broken snare again, sliding her fingers across the rusted metal. The grooves on the steel were precise, clean, professional. Someone who knew how to snap bone. Someone who didn't care what screamed when the teeth closed. And the bridge, her truck, hadn't just been a disaster. It had been a message. Or a mistake. She wasn't sure which one scared her more. Wren tugged on her sleeve gently, tiny fingers trembling. Lydia knelt, gathering the small creature into her arms. Wren pressed its face against her chest, letting out a shaky exhale that sounded far too human for something covered in fur. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." Rowan watched them silently. Then he made a sound, a low rumble from deep in his chest. Not threatening, not mournful, something in between. A sound that felt like a memory, shared without words. He turned and motioned with one large hand toward the ravine beyond the clearing. He wanted to show her more. Lydia followed. The children stayed close, their small footsteps brushing through fallen needles as Rowan guided them through a narrow path shadowed by old spruces. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting a shot to ring out or a trap to snap at any moment. Halfway down the ravine, they came across another snare. This one mangled, twisted entirely out of shape, bent open as if someone had gripped the steel jaws and pried them apart with bare hands. Rowan had. His blood still stained the edges, long dried into a dark brown crust. Lydia reached toward it, imagining the pain he must have felt snapping the steel open, to free another creature. Maybe even the children. Maybe even the mother. Her throat tightened. How many battles had he fought alone? How many others had died? She looked up at Rowan. "You've been trying to protect them," she whispered. The big creature inhaled deeply, as if the admission carried a weight he finally didn't have to hold alone. They moved again, past dead patches of moss, past pools of water that shimmered with toxins, past claw marks on trees that weren't warnings, but signs of desperation. Then Rowan stopped. Ahead of them, half hidden under a collapsed log, was a cluster of smaller traps. Metal snares, steel jaw clamps, all branded with SP. Not for predators, for a massacre. Lydia felt her legs wobble. She lowered herself to the ground, staring at the pile of metal. She reached for one. Her fingers trembled. She turned it over. There, across the underside of the steel, etched with grim pride, was a phrase. "Clean the woods." Her heartbeat thundered. Everything inside her tightened into a sharp, terrifying clarity. Samuel Pike had been hunting them for years, and he had no intention of stopping. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. She felt Wren's small hand curl into her palm, grounding her. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Rowan. His gaze was steady, determined. He wasn't asking for help. He was asking for her choice. And standing there in that poisoned ravine, surrounded by rusted metal and the ghosts of creatures who never had a chance, Lydia made one. She would not run. She would not hide. She would not let this forest become a graveyard for things that only wanted to live quietly. She stood, brushing dirt from her palms. Then she whispered to Rowan, firm, steady, certain, "I'll help you." Rowan exhaled, a slow, deep breath that felt like the whole forest had been holding it. Above them, somewhere far off, a twig snapped. Every head turned, even the children. Lydia's skin prickled. Her pulse surged. They weren't alone. And the woods, once just a quiet home for things that hid from the world, suddenly felt like a chessboard with too many pieces in motion. But she didn't step back. She tightened her grip on Wren. And the path forward opened, dark, dangerous, but no longer walked alone. The forest didn't sleep. It only paused. And when it did, something else listened. Lydia moved between the trees with a body that ached from more than walking. She felt the burn in her calves, the sting in her palms where bark had scraped her raw earlier that morning. But most of all, she felt the weight of the choice she'd already made. Not to leave them behind. Not Rowan. Not the little ones. Not this time. The group was smaller now, quieter. Rowan moved slower than usual, his massive frame stooping slightly, favoring his right side. Lydia didn't have to see under the thick, matted fur to know something was wrong. He'd been limping since before dawn. Just a subtle shift in his gait, until the moment he staggered. They had passed a creek she remembered from her youth. It ran along the edge of her late husband's old patrol trail, now overgrown, forgotten by most. Rowan paused by the base of a crumbling rock shelf, sniffed the air, then took one more step and froze. The trap snapped like a gunshot. Lydia screamed before she even saw him fall. He buckled sideways with a roar that echoed off the cliffs, shaking the birds loose from the pines. His leg was caught, the same kind of steel-jawed monstrosity she'd seen earlier, half buried beneath leaves and moss. Blood smeared instantly down his calf, thick and dark and pouring fast. Stone shrieked, a wild, guttural cry, and mirth pulled him back. Wren ducked behind Lydia's legs. Ridge pressed flat to the ground, body shaking uncontrollably. Lydia ran. By the time she reached him, Rowan had stopped struggling. He lay on his side, teeth bared, breath heaving through his nose. His hand gripped the trap, not to pry it open, but to keep from tearing himself apart trying. She dropped to her knees, hands flying to the hinge. It didn't budge. Her mind splintered. A memory cut through, 10 years ago. Same forest, same screech of metal. Back then, it had been Rowan bleeding under a rusted wire snare near a hunting blind, his shoulder slashed deep. She'd used her car's tire iron and an old belt to free him. Her fingers had trembled. She hadn't known what he was, only that he was dying. And she hadn't hesitated. Now she was here again, older, tired, but still the only thing between him and a slow death. She looked around, no tools, no leverage, just rock, dirt, and rotting wood. She grabbed a long branch from the creek side and wedged it beneath the trap's hinge, planting her knees hard against the ground, biting her lip so she wouldn't cry out. She shoved. Nothing. She adjusted. Blood from her palms stained the bark. Splinters bit deep into her skin. She pushed again, gritting her teeth. Rowan let out a low growl. Not at her, but at himself. His body trembled with pain, but he didn't lash out. He laid one heavy hand on her shoulder, just for a moment. Not to stop her, to thank her. Her breath caught in her throat. The lever gave. The trap loosened. Rowan gasped and pulled his leg free, rolling to his side. Blood poured freely now, but the worst of the damage was beneath the skin. Torn muscle, cracked bone. Lydia fell back, hands shaking, arms useless from the strain. And then she felt it, soft. Wren curled beside her, tiny fingers patting at her wrist. The others followed, one by one. Stone climbed into her lap, silent. Mirth placed her small hand against Lydia's heart, like checking if it still beat. Ridge leaned his forehead against her arm. They surrounded her, touched her, chose her, not because they had to, because they saw what she was willing to give. She looked up at Rowan. He was watching, bleeding, but his eyes were no longer clouded. They were focused, clear. He would live if they moved fast. She stood, pulling at a bundle of moss and fern nearby, packing it tight around the wound. She tied one of the old cloth scraps from her coat sleeve around it, pressing hard. Rowan winced but stayed still. Then she looked up the trail. They had to go. She led the way, through the valley, across a dry gulch, past a tangle of old trees where her husband used to build makeshift shelters during patrol shifts. She remembered something he once said on a foggy morning after a long night shift. The forest's got a memory, Lyd, not just of who dies in it, but of who tries to keep others alive. They reached the ridge by dusk. She had hoped it would take longer, but they weren't alone anymore. The ridge overlooked a narrow fire break near the abandoned trailhead. Below, two men stood around a campfire. One she knew instantly, Samuel Pike, wearing the same canvas jacket he'd worn the day of the county hearing, his back stiff, arms folded, rifle leaning on a log. The second man was younger, unfamiliar. A buyer, a stranger with expensive boots and a too-clean backpack. They were laughing. Samuel lifted a can of beer and shouted something over the fire. The stranger replied, laughing louder. Lydia ducked behind a boulder, heart racing. She looked at Rowan, who crouched just beside her, chest still heaving, eyes locked onto the fire below. She could feel the shift in him. The hunter had come too close, and this time it was Rowan who wanted to fight. But he couldn't, not with his leg, not like this. She touched his arm. "No," she whispered. "You've already bled enough." He didn't look at her, but he didn't move forward either. The children huddled behind a tree trunk, low to the ground. Wren reached out and brushed a hand over Rowan's fur, the smallest of comforts. Below, the men loaded gear. The stranger held up a rifle with a scope, admiring it like a trophy. Samuel said something and pointed toward the trees, exactly where they stood. Lydia's heart dropped. They were coming this way. Rowan shifted, and Lydia knew if they made it to the ridge, he would launch himself off it to protect them, wounded or not. She couldn't let that happen. She turned to the children. She turned to Rowan, and then she stepped out, into the firelight, down the trail, toward the sound of footsteps, the weight of rifles, the rising dark. She didn't know what she'd say, only that she had to buy time, only that she had to stand between the hunter and the hunted, and that this time, when death came looking, it would not find them cowering. It would find her. The cold came quickly once the sun dropped behind the ridge. Not the kind that made you shiver right away, but the kind that settled in slowly, like regret. Lydia had led them farther than she thought possible. Rowan, limping and bleeding, but never once falling behind. And the four little ones, each one pressing forward with a quiet bravery that kept her moving even when her legs screamed to stop. They reached the clearing just as the last of the light faded. A structure stood half sunken into the hillside, its edges camouflaged by overgrowth and time. It looked more like a ruin than shelter. An old research station, maybe government-funded once, long before this part of the forest had been forgotten. Its planks were gray with rot, the door hanging open, but the roof still held. And that was enough. Lydia stepped inside first. The air was dry, musty. Dust floated in the shaft of moonlight that cut through the broken window. She cleared a path through overturned crates and rusted tools, then waved the others in. Rowan ducked beneath the doorway. His breath hitched when he bent his injured leg. Blood had soaked through the moss wrap she'd tied around it earlier, and every time he exhaled, it sounded thinner. She gestured toward the back wall, where the old cot still stood. He eased himself down slowly. Not a groan. Not a sound. but his body trembled for a full minute after. She turned to the little ones. They moved carefully now, instinctively quiet. Ridge curled into the corner near a pile of old canvas. Stone found a broken stool and sat with his knees tucked under his chin. Mirth helped Wren remove a thorn from her foot, and then tucked the smaller one beneath her arm. Lydia moved to the cabinet behind the desk, searching for anything, blankets, supplies, something useful. What she found stopped her cold. A stack of notebooks, water-warped and yellowed. One of them bore a name she hadn't seen in years. Walter Crane, her grandfather. She opened the first page slowly, and there it was. His handwriting, blocky and clean. The same as in the letters he used to leave her on the kitchen counter. June 3rd, 1947. Observation. Subject still returns to creek at dawn. Pattern suggests memory of injury. Subject no longer fears me. She flipped ahead, page after page. Drawings of footprints, notes on vocalizations, weather patterns, emotional response charts, and then one line that made her breath catch. Saw it limping again today. Same shoulder, same scar. I think it's the same one as 1939. She looked across the room at Rowan. His eyes were closed, but barely. She didn't say it aloud, but she didn't have to. Her grandfather had met him too, or something like him, and he hadn't hunted it. He'd watched, he'd learned, he'd cared. This wasn't just about Rowan. It was about a lineage of quiet understanding passed like a secret between the few willing to see. Lydia took the notebook and placed it gently on the desk. Outside, a branch cracked. Not far. She froze. Rowan opened his eyes. The children stilled. No one spoke. She moved toward the door, peered through the gap. A set of boot prints in the mud, fresh, heavy. She backed away from the light. Samuel Pike had found them, and he wasn't alone. Earlier, she'd seen him speaking with the buyer. Someone she didn't recognize, but who looked too clean, too casual, like he was hunting a trophy, not a threat. They had guns, traps, and time. Lydia turned back to Rowan. He met her gaze. This was the moment. She could take the notebooks, the children, and run deeper. Maybe get help. Maybe find someone who still listened to reason. But it would take time. And Rowan. He wouldn't make it. She walked to him, knelt by his side. His breathing was shallow now. Fever had crept in. She reached up and pressed a hand to his cheek. Not fur, not skin, but something in between. His eyes blinked slowly. There was no fear in them, only fatigue. Then Mirth stepped forward. The child held out a smooth stone, no bigger than a plum, wrapped in strands of dry grass. She placed it into Lydia's palm, then pressed her forehead gently to Lydia's shoulder. Lydia understood. This was a gift, a memory, a request. Her voice shook. You want me to protect them? Mirth nodded once. Ridge stood too. So did the others, silent, steady. Wren reached out and placed a tiny hand over Lydia's heart. That was the moment she made her decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't leave. She'd already lost one child in these woods. She wasn't losing 4 more. She stood, picked up the iron bar leaning in the corner, the remains of an old lantern stand, and moved to the door. Rowan tried to rise, but his body gave way. She turned back and whispered, No, this time I stand for you. The children stayed behind, pressed into the shadows. Lydia stepped into the clearing. Fog had crept in, thin and pale across the ground. The trees loomed like watchers. The moon cut a silver line down the center of the path, and at the edge of it stood Samuel Pike. He was older now than she remembered. His beard was grayer, but his eyes were the same, cold and sure of themselves. Well, he said, raising the rifle, I thought I saw something moving. She didn't flinch. Go home, Samuel. He smirked. You brought it on yourself, Lydia. Should have stayed in town. Let the forest clean itself. You mean the way you clean it? She said softly. With poison and snares? He shrugged. You don't kill rats with kindness. There are children back there, she said. Do you even care? He frowned, just slightly. Don't lie to yourself, he muttered. They're not yours. Her grip tightened on the iron bar. He took a step forward. "Move aside. I'll make it quick." She didn't. Behind her, a low sound rumbled from the doorway. Rowan, not standing, but awake. Watching, Samuel raised his gun. Lydia stepped in front of it and didn't move. The night went still. Even the wind waited. The rifle cocked. Then a voice cut through the dark. "Drop it." A flashlight beam lit Samuel's chest. From the trees stepped a woman in a ranger's jacket, her badge half hidden beneath a raincoat. "Federal wildlife officer," she said flatly. "Hands in the air." Samuel turned stunned. Marion Burke. Lydia didn't recognize her, but she recognized the look in her eyes. The kind of woman who'd been tracking something for months and had just found the truth. Samuel hesitated. His finger twitched. Then Rowan's shadow shifted behind Lydia. The gun swung. Marion shouted. Rowan lunged. A shot cracked. Lydia hit the ground. Dust flew. Silence. Then breathing. Rowan was down again, but alive. The bullet had struck near the old scar, but not deep. Marion had rushed forward, weapon still drawn. Samuel lay face down, pinned, growling curses into the dirt. It was over, but not quiet. Not yet. Marion turned toward Lydia, eyes wide as she saw Rowan rise again slowly, bloodied but standing. The children emerged from the cabin, all four, Mirth first, holding Wren's hand, then Ridge and Stone. They stood beside Lydia, and without instruction, without fear, they each reached up and touched her legs, her arms, her side, claiming her, choosing her. Marion's face changed, her weapon lowered, and for the first time in her life, Lydia saw a law officer put her duty aside in favor of something greater, understanding. Rowan dropped to his knees beside her. He rested his head gently against her shoulder. His breath was ragged, his body weak, but he was alive. So were they all. Lydia placed her hand over his. Then she turned to Marion and finally spoke. "Now, what do we do next?" The forest healed slowly, the way old wounds do, quietly, beneath layers of time and moss. Weeks passed in a rhythm Lydia hadn't known she needed, and the world beyond the trees faded into something she visited only when necessary. Her cabin at the edge of Blue River became a place between worlds, where the wild and the human breathed under the same roof. The nights brought cold, but not emptiness. The days carried work, but not loneliness. And for the first time since Willow's passing, Lydia woke each morning to something that resembled purpose. Rowan survived the bullet. He didn't walk at first. His body had taken too much poison, steel, shock. But the old cabin had a warmth that seemed to seep into him. Lydia tended to him the way one tends to a living memory, with hands steady even when her heart trembled. Marion visited often, bringing salve, herbs, gauze, sometimes just silence. And Rowan, in his quiet way, learned to lean against the old wooden bed frame and breathe without pain. The four little ones healed faster. They were different now. Still wild, still skittish when the wind snapped too suddenly, but wary in a way that meant survival, not fear. They roamed the perimeter of the cabin at night, leaving trails in the frost and tiny fingerprints on the porch rail. Sometimes Lydia caught Wren peeking through the window as she cooked. Sometimes Stone left pine cones arranged neatly on the doorstep. Ridge brushed snow off her walkway with a clumsy branch. Mirth stayed closest to Rowan, always the first to check his breathing when he shifted in his sleep. Lydia often found herself sitting on the porch in those pale dawn hours, watching the mist rise from the river. Some mornings she thought she heard Willow's laugh carried in the wind, impossibly soft. Other mornings she felt her daughter in the way Wren curled into her lap, or in the way Mirth looked at her like the world wasn't as cruel as it once seemed. But the forest didn't forget what happened. Samuel Pike went to prison. Marion testified. Lydia did too. The evidence spoke louder than any of them. The poisons, the traps, the abandoned mine runoff he'd used to bait wildlife. His own notebook sealed his fate. The court called it environmental terrorism. Lydia called it grief misplaced into hatred. But even in court, she saw something strange in him. Not regret, recognition, as if he finally understood he had been fighting a ghost only he could see. When she visited him months later, she brought her grandfather's journal. He didn't take it at first, just stared. She placed it on the table between them anyway. "Read it," she said. "It might teach you something about what you spent your life trying to kill." He didn't answer, but he didn't push the journal away either. That was enough. The forest softened as winter approached. The children grew, shedding their sickly frailty. Ridge, once barely strong enough to stand, climbed the lower pines now with a confidence that made Lydia smile. Mirth learned to mimic the sound of her kettle whistle. Stone became fierce in play, protective of Wren, charging at shadows he thought were threats. Wren learned to braid grass, strange little knots that she left for Lydia on the porch steps just before dawn. The bond between Rowan and Lydia deepened in ways no language could hold. He couldn't speak. She didn't need him to. When she placed her hand on his shoulder, he'd lower his head gently, as if acknowledging something sacred. When he saw her struggling with memories or exhaustion, he'd tap 2 fingers to his chest. His way of telling her he remembered too. His leg never fully healed. He walked, yes, but not with the effortless grace he once had. His stride carried weight, the kind that reminded him of bullets, metal jaws, and betrayal. He stayed close to the cabin, close to Lydia, close to the children who orbited around him like planets around a wounded sun. One evening, after a long day gathering wood and tending to Rowan's leg, Lydia stepped outside to check on the children. She found them at the tree line, standing around a circle of stones. It wasn't random. It wasn't childish. The stones were arranged carefully, small ones encircling a larger one in the center, with pine needles fanned out like rays, a memorial for the mother they lost, for the life they fled. Lydia's throat tightened. Mirth noticed her and walked over, placing a smaller stone in Lydia's hand. It was smooth, worn by river water, the color of dawn. Lydia set it beside the largest stone and whispered a thank you that the trees swallowed without echo. Rowan watched from the porch, his eyes reflecting the small ritual. Memory wasn't a burden for him. It was a compass. As months passed, Rowan grew stronger, but he never returned deep into the wild. The injury had marked his path. He became something else now, a sentinel, a presence on the ridge, a shadow that locals spoke of without fear. People claimed they saw a figure at dusk, standing just beyond the clearing, silent, watchful. Some said it was a legend. Some said a guardian. Only Lydia knew the truth. He was not guarding the forest. He was guarding her, and she guarded him in return. Years layered themselves into the wood of the cabin. The seasons came and went, each one carving a memory into the land. The little ones grew taller, stronger, more independent. They didn't stay forever. They couldn't. The wild pulled at them, calling them back to the deeper heart of the forest. But they never disappeared completely. Sometimes Lydia woke to find fresh berries arranged in baskets by her door. Sometimes she spotted Ridge perched in a high tree, watching her hang laundry, vanishing before she could wave. Sometimes she heard laughter in the branches above her, the kind that didn't belong to human children. Rowan stayed the longest. He slept by the porch when the nights were cold, sometimes inside when storms made the cabin shake. He would sit on the floor while Lydia read aloud, sometimes from her grandfather's journal, sometimes from books she had once read to Willow. He always listened, years later, when Rowan's breath grew shallow again. Not from wounds, but from age. Lydia stayed beside him the same way she had on the night of the gunshot. She held his hand, brushing her fingers over the fur as his chest rose and fell like a slow tide. The children, now grown, gathered around, not as frightened orphans, as guardians in their own right. They stood in silence, honoring him the only way they knew. When his final breath left him, it was gentle, like a candle going out in a room already warmed by years of flame. The forest didn't mourn loudly. It mourned in the hush of wind, in the soft sway of branches, in the hush of creatures passing unseen. Lydia buried him on the ridge overlooking the river. She marked the grave with stones. Heavy, ancient ones. She rolled herself across the clearing. The children helped, carrying smaller stones, weaving pine boughs between them. They carved one phrase into the largest stone, pressing their hands into the dirt to steady it. The one who remembered. Lydia cried for the first time in years. Not because of loss, because memory had finally found a home. That night, as she stood beside the grave, a shape appeared at the edge of the trees. Tall, strong, familiar in ways she couldn't explain. Its eyes glowed softly in the moonlight, an amber color she'd only seen once before, in willow. The shape lingered, head tilted, watching her with a gentleness she hadn't felt since her daughter held her hand for the last time. Then it stepped back into the woods, leaving no footprints, only a breath of wind brushing against her cheek like a goodbye. And a promise. The forest remembers. Always. Lydia stayed on the ridge long after the figure vanished. The moon climbed higher, silvering the bark of the pines and painting the stones in soft light. She placed her hand atop Rowan's grave and closed her eyes. The night wasn't cold. Not anymore. When she finally walked back to the cabin, the trees seemed to shift just enough to clear her path. As though the forest itself had bowed its head, she stepped onto the porch and looked across the valley. Somewhere out there, between memory and myth, life carried on. Not untouched, but unbroken. The wind rose gently, carrying a familiar rhythm through the branches. The echo of footsteps she knew by heart. The breath of a friend who had once carried her through the dark. And she smiled, because some stories don't end. They keep living in the quiet places. They keep breathing through those who remember. They keep walking through the woods long after bodies rest beneath stone. And they keep echoing in the hearts of those who choose kindness when the world demands fear. Lydia stepped inside her cabin, leaving the door slightly open behind her, letting the night breeze wander through like an old companion. The forest answered with a soft rustle, a memory alive, a debt repaid, a promise kept. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the quietest places, the places untouched by maps, far from crowds, where the trees grow old and the wind remembers things. And within those places, every so often, something unexpected happens. A stranger reaches across the line between fear and trust, and chooses kindness instead. This story, in its truest form, has never been about monsters or myths. It's about the invisible threads that tie us together, the ones made not of blood or language, but of instinct, memory, and the human heart's deep hunger to belong. It's about how compassion, once given freely, can echo for years through silence, through grief, and even through generations of those who do not speak our words, but understand our actions. We often talk about debt as something owed in coin, in time, in blood. But the deepest debts are made of something far more powerful. The moment someone chooses to remember your pain as if it were their own. And when that memory is honored, not out of obligation, but out of love, it transforms into something holy. What we pass down isn't just stories. It's how we treat the world when we think no one is watching. A small act of mercy in one decade can become the shelter someone else finds in the next. A kindness extended to a wounded creature can ripple outward into a legacy of protection, reverence, and hope. In the end, we are all, in some way, walking through the forest of our own past, carrying both what we've lost and what we still hope to find. And maybe, just maybe, if we slow down enough to listen, to the wind, to the breath of the earth, to the quiet footsteps beside us, we'll hear that some hearts never stop beating, some memories never fade, and some bonds, no matter how improbable, are too sacred to break. Thank you, dear listener, for walking this path with us. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you once held, or a choice you still carry, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what this journey stirred in your heart. And if you believe stories like this matter, Stories that choose empathy over fear, memory over oblivion. Consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to tell these quiet tales with the depth and care they deserve. Until next time, may you walk gently, remember often, and never stop listening to the forest.